is Jade Lee. I'm the project manager of Multicultural Economic Participation Forum. Welcome to come to this first session of our forum on this beautiful Saturday morning. First, I would like to pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and the original owners and the continuing custodian of this land, and acknowledge elders past and present. We're here today because we want to find a way out. Facing a common challenge of the economic downturn, partly due to COVID-19, the migrant community wanted to think about our potential in a proactive way. So after discussing with a few cultural community group leaders, we came up with this idea of starting a forum to invite speakers to guide us to start thinking about the big picture of the Tasmanian economy, and then use our own intellectual resources to think about potential solutions where we should fit in this picture. So we're very fortunate today to have two great speakers. One, Saul Eslake, who is a very well-known independent economist nationally, but located in Tasmania, so we're very fortunate. And then we have Luke Doyle from Hobart City Council, Economic Development and Strategy. So without further delay, I would like to kickstart this event today. But first, I would like to take care of some housekeeping issues. Due to COVID restrictions, make sure everyone keep 1.5 meters from each other. Social distancing is important. And two, the facilities emergency assembly point is out of this door if anything happens. And toilets is when you go out of that door to your left. We prepared morning tea for everyone. It will be served during break time. Please do not serve yourself. That's under COVID restriction guideline as well. We have volunteers wearing gloves and masks to serve you. All right. Without further delay, can I first introduce Boshra from Hobart City Council, just to say a few words about City of Hobart's support to this forum project. But I do want to mention that City of Glenorchy also supported this forum, but they cannot make it here today. I just want to acknowledge their support as well. Okay, Boshra.
Thank you so much, Jade, and good morning, everyone. Very briefly, I would like to commend Jade and her extensive team for developing the idea for this project and bringing it to life. The City of Hobart is very proud to have funded this project, and we look forward to learning alongside all of you about how we can increase the participation of multicultural communities in the Tasmanian economy. The funding for this project was made available through the Resilient Hobart Grant Round that opened during COVID restrictions, with the specific aim of helping communities recover from the impact of COVID-19. The City of Hobart is hoping to have a new grant round opening this month, and we encourage everyone to contact us if you have an idea for the community that could benefit with some funding. I hope you find today's session beneficial and take the opportunity to connect with other community members and agencies. Thank you, Jade. Thank you all.
Thank you, Boshra. May I introduce our facilitator today, Mr. Ian Whitehouse, to say a few words so he can introduce our speakers. Yeah, cheers.
Thanks, Jade. And look, welcome everybody. My role today is pretty simple. It's just to facilitate some of the conversations and dialogues between Saul and Luke. We've also got some questions that have been posted prior to the event today. So if you've got questions throughout the forum, you might just want to hold them, and then at the end or as the speakers might invite you to ask some questions, please feel free to put those questions forward. Every question is a good question, so don't be afraid or frightened. If you've got a question that you might want to have asked and you're a little worried about asking it yourself, please just connect with me in the break and I'd be very happy to represent your question for you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Saul Eslake. It's a real privilege, Saul, to have you here today. And thank you so much for your contribution today for the broader community. So thank you, and I'd welcome Saul to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, ni hao, namaste, oha gozaimasu, dobry den, kalimera ses, buongiorno, bonjour, and all those sorts of things. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum. Can I, like Jay, begin by acknowledging that these are the traditional lands of the Muanina people and pay my respects to the elders past and present and emerging of all the Palawa people of Lutrawita, as they call Tasmania in Palawakani. It's in some ways a pleasure to be part of a gathering of Tasmania's multicultural community. Well, in lots of ways it's a pleasure, really. But what I was going to say is that one of the many ways in which Tasmania differs from the rest of Australia is that we're the least multicultural of any of Australia's states. According to the most recent census in 2016, only 19% of Tasmanians were born overseas, compared with 33% of Australians. Only 14.5% of Tasmanians had both parents born overseas, compared with 34.4% of Australians. And only 6.5% of Tasmanians speak a language other than English at home, compared with 22% of Australians. In some ways, Australia is the most multicultural society in the world, with the possible exception of Israel, although there's something else that unites most of the people of Israel, of course, other than where they come from. But Tasmania is the least multicultural part of one of the world's most multicultural countries. And that's not a good thing. It would be a good thing if, in that respect, if not in some others, Tasmania were more like the rest of Australia. There are some other important ways in which Tasmania differs from the rest of Australia that I think over time we need to change to become more like the rest of Australia if we're to solve some of the economic challenges and problems that we face now, that we've actually faced for a very long period of time. For example, we are poorly educated compared with the rest of Australia. Fewer than 24% of Tasmanians have a university degree or a diploma, compared with 31% of all Australians. On the other hand, more than 28% of Tasmanians have no education beyond year 10 of high school, compared with fewer than 20% of all Australians. We're older, on average, than other Australians. The median age of Tasmanians is almost 40. That is, half the population is over 40 and half the population is under 40, whereas for Australia as a whole, the median age is 37. And the gap between those two is widening quite quickly. We're poorer than the rest of Australia. According to the most recent survey of these things, which was for the 2017-18 financial year, the average household disposable income of Tasmanian households, after making allowance for differences in the number of people living in those households, was $922 a week in Tasmania. That's 13% below the national average of $1,062 a week. The net worth of the average Tasmanian household, that is all of their assets, like their house, financial assets, minus what they owe by way of, for example, mortgage debt, in Tasmania was 709,000. That's 31% lower than the national average of 1.02 million. We don't work as much as other Australians. In March, before the pandemic made a mess of employment here and elsewhere, only 58% of Tasmanians aged 15 and over had a job, compared with 63% of all Australians. Now, if the difference was because more Tasmanians were attending school or university, that might be okay, but of course that isn't the reason at all. 32% of us are dependent on government pensions or benefits, compared with 22% of all Australians. And all of those things are things that we need to change in some way if we're going to overcome some of the economic challenges and problems that we face now and that we faced for a long time. That's not to say we want to be, or even could be if we wanted to, the same as the big cities of Sydney and Melbourne. We're not. And there are lots of things about living in Tasmania that in some ways make up for some of those other differences. After all, I lived in Melbourne for 31 years. That's more than half my life. And I choose to come back and live where I grew up because there are things that are hard to put dollar signs around that still make Tasmania where I want to live, and which I want to be at least part of my children's experience, so that at some point in the future, although they'll probably have to go to the mainland to get a job, or they may choose to go overseas, which I think would be good for them, they might want to come back to live in Tasmania at some stage and perhaps raise my grandchildren here. Obviously, we're here thinking about the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on our lives and the lives of the people that we know and care about. In some ways, we've handled that pretty well. After a bad start with that outbreak along the northwest coast that wasn't entirely our fault, but we've had 43 cases of COVID-19 per 100,000 people. That's a lot less than Victoria with 292 per 100,000 people, a bit less than Victoria with 50 cases per 100,000 people, but not as good as the rest of Australia, South Australia, Western Australia, Queensland and the Territories. Sadly, 2.4 Tasmanians have died for every 100,000 people in this state. Again, that's better than Victoria, where almost 9 per 100,000 people have died, but it's a lot higher than anywhere else in the country. That's partly, of course, because as you know, COVID-19 is more deadly for older people who catch it, and we've got a higher proportion of older people in our community than any other part of the country. But that doesn't explain all of the reasons why we have had more deaths as a proportion of our population than any other part of the country except Victoria. It says something about the adequacy of our health system that I'll leave for others to comment more on. Obviously, keeping the number of infections and deaths down to as low as possible has taken an economic toll. Governments have deemed it necessary, and most people have accepted that it's been necessary to restrict what we can do in order to contain the spread of the virus. Fortunately, we're not locked down as harshly, and we haven't been locked down for as long as the poor people of Victoria have been, nor should I say in passing, has our government been as eager to extract our money in the form of fines as the Victorian government has been. Not that that's helped them deal with the pandemic at all, but there has been a significant cost in terms of people not able to go to work and earn an income, not able to operate their businesses, as well as some of the costs that are harder to measure in dollar terms, such as not being able to visit family and friends who might be on the other side of Bass Strait. We learned this week with the release of the national accounts figures, the ones that, if you remember, officially confirmed, not that we needed official confirmation, that Australia was in its first recession since the early 1990s. As part of those figures, the Stats Bureau releases estimates of what it calls state final demand, which is the sum of spending by households, businesses and governments within each state. It's not the same thing as a state equivalent of GDP or gross domestic product, because it doesn't include interstate or international exports, but it's the closest thing we have to the broadest measure of economic activity on a quarterly basis in each state. And that showed that Tasmania's state final demand, that is spending by everyone in Tasmania, contracted, shrank by 7.4% in the June quarter. That's not as bad as New South Wales or Victoria, where the contraction was 8.5%, but it was worse than Queensland, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, or Western Australia, where the contraction was about 6% in the June quarter, and it was worse than either of the two territories. So we paid an economic price, and although the September quarter, that is the quarter we're now in, won't be nearly as bad as the June quarter was, indeed it's probable that there was an increase in economic activity in the September quarter, and hopefully there will be one in the December quarter, especially if, as the Premier has promised, interstate borders will be reopened from the 1st of December, and let's hope that that's right. We should now be on a path out of the economic hole into which we, like every other part of Australia, indeed like every other part of the world, has fallen into since the 3rd or 4th week of March this year. In thinking about how we might recover here in Tasmania from the economic difficulties that we've been afflicted by during that time, there are 5 particular challenges that we need to think about and work out what they mean for us. The first of those is that Tasmania's economy has become very dependent on tourism. One of the reasons why our economy did almost as badly as New South Wales and Victoria, and not as well or as less badly, if that's the right word, it's not very good English, as Queensland, Western Australia and South Australia, is that the tourism industry was by its very nature more hard hit by the restrictions on the movement of people. So it stands to reason that any economy that's more dependent on tourism is, everything else being equal, going to have a tougher time of it. Tourism accounts for 11% of Tasmania's economy, our gross product, compared with 6.5% of Australia's. It accounts for 17.5% of employment directly and indirectly, compared with 8% for Australia as a whole. In other words, if you like, twice as many jobs in Tasmania are dependent on tourism as in the rest of the country. And for the last 10 years, we've been telling ourselves that's a good thing. Yes, certainly tourism, the increase in the number of people visiting here, both from the mainland and from overseas, has boosted our economy. Since Xi Jinping made his visit in November 2014, a lot more Chinese tourists have come here, partly because he came here and appeared to enjoy himself. And the government has set targets to increase the number of visitors to Tasmania to, I think, something like 2 million by the middle of this decade, by 2025. Apologies if I haven't got that figure exactly right. And there's no doubt that tourism has been a money spinner for some of the big companies in the state who operate hotels and other things tourists go to. And it's also been something of a boon for individuals, mums and dads, as our politicians like to say, who've been able to rent out a room in their house to visitors, or to convert what had been a rental property, which they might have rented out at $400 a week all through the year to a local, instead to a property that they can rent out for, say, $200 a night for half the year to interstate visitors, although that's had some downside consequences for people who've been looking for rental accommodation here in Hobart. But beyond that, I don't think enough people have asked whether the boom in tourism has been as good for Tasmania as our government wants us to think. Apart from the owners of businesses who benefit from tourism, most of the jobs created in tourism have been poorly paid, are part-time, are highly seasonal, and offer very little prospect for promotion or career development. And so as we think about what sort of Tasmania we want to have in the post-pandemic world, we might need to ask ourselves, do we really want to be as dependent on tourism as we've allowed ourselves to become? A second challenge for us is that we're very dependent on agriculture compared with the rest of the country. Agriculture accounts for 9.5% of Tasmania's economy compared with 2.3% of Australia's. It accounts for 6.5% of all the jobs in Tasmania compared with 2.8% of Australia's. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing because we're good at agriculture. You know, our climate, our rainfall, some of our history means that we're very good at things like dairying, for example. And although it's not a huge output compared with, say, South Australia or New South Wales, we produce some of the world's best wine at very high prices. And we do the same with beef and seafood and other things like that, which we're capable of doing, not necessarily at the lowest prices in the world, but at prices that discerning customers, especially in Asia, but also in Europe, are willing to pay high prices because they recognize the high quality. So I'm not necessarily saying about agriculture what I said about tourism, that we've perhaps become too dependent on it. But what I do want to say is that there is an increasing risk attached to it, which we have to think of, and that is that our agricultural exports have become very dependent on China. And while China's been a very good market for us, given the deterioration in the political relationship between Australia and China in recent months, with no prospect that that's going to change, and given that China, whether it likes to or not, is going to have to continue buying Western Australia's iron ore and Queensland's coking or metallurgical coal for the foreseeable future, because there's no alternative to that, it means that whenever Beijing gets angry with Australia for having, as they like to say, offended the feelings of the Chinese people, and putting to one side whether that's actually true or not, China's retaliation for what it perceives as behaviour by the Australian government that it doesn't like disproportionately falls on agricultural products. And with the possible exception of the iron ore that comes out of Savage River on the northwest coast, that's really all we sell to China. So although we haven't yet been caught up with the trouble that the barley exporters have been into, all our other agricultural and seafood exports to China are at risk. Two factors over which we have absolutely no control. And I'm not saying that we should stop sending things to China, but perhaps I'm saying we ought to look for other markets elsewhere in Asia and in Europe and in other parts of the world as well, rather than being so dependent on a single market as we've allowed ourselves to become. Because as I say, we've got no control over what happens there. And other people can make decisions that have an adverse impact on us through no fault of our own. The third thing is that we in Tasmania are very dependent on government. 21% of Tasmanians in employment work for governments, federal, state or local, compared with 16% of all Australians. And in particular, we are very dependent on the federal government. 61% of the Tasmanian government's revenue comes from Canberra, either in the form of our share of GST revenues or from Commonwealth grants for specific purposes like hospitals or schools or roads. For other state and territory governments, that figure averages out at 44%. And again, that means that we are vulnerable to things over which we have no control, such as the fact that people have stopped spending on things that carry the GST, which means that the pool of GST that's carved up among the states is going to be smaller than it otherwise was. And since we get a bigger share of that GST revenue compared with our population than any other part of the country except the Northern Territory, when the GST revenue falls, or when the federal government thinks we need to buy votes from Western Australia, who, despite being the richest country in the nation, want a bigger share of the GST than they get, then that's inevitably at our expense. And as I say, just like things happening between Canberra and Beijing, over which we have no control, we have no control over any of those sorts of things. We only have 5 federal seats in the House of Representatives, 3 of which at most will ever change at elections. Western Australia has 15 seats, for example. We can't compete with that. So we're vulnerable in that sense, and perhaps we shouldn't be. And we've also become very dependent on immigration as a driver of economic growth. Now that might surprise you because I said before that we're the least multicultural country in the state in the country. But let me explain it a bit more. Partly because we're old, the population growth we can generate on our own is pretty small. Over the last, in 2019, I should say, 28%, yeah, no, other way around. 79% of our population growth in 2019 came from immigration, either from overseas or interstate, whereas for Australia as a whole, the corresponding figure is 60%. Within our immigration intake, 28% came from the mainland and 51% came from overseas. And the key point here is that in the short term, there's not going to be much of either of those. There's not going to be any overseas immigration to Tasmania or to any other state until the federal government lifts the ban on people coming here, which they're not going to do until at least June. And even then, the government probably won't allow as many migrants to come here if there are still lots of Australians without jobs, as they're likely to be. And so we won't get the overseas migrants that we have been getting in recent years that have driven our economy. And who knows whether we will get the same flow of interstate immigration as we had been getting in the last 4 or 5 years. And as I say, both of those have been good for Tasmania, but my point is that we can't rely on them being as good in the post-COVID world as they have been over the past 4 or 5 years. So what should we be doing about that? Let me say front up, I don't have all of the answers. And I'm not going to pretend to you that I do. But I think there are at least 6 things that we ought to be thinking about as we try and think about what sort of economy and society we can build in Tasmania once this health crisis has passed. I think the first and most important thing, which I've been saying for years, but I think it's no less important in the post-COVID world than it was before March this year, is we've got to improve access to education and the quality of education that Tasmanians get. Only 73% of Tasmanian kids in year 10 go on to year 12, compared with 83% of kids in year 10 in the rest of Australia. Only 59% of kids doing year 10 get to complete their year 12, compared with 79% of Australian kids in year 10 across the country. And the biggest single reason for that failure is our long-standing college system, which in effect says you can't finish year 12 where you start year 7. You've got to go somewhere else. And of course, if you live in a small town, which a much bigger proportion of Tasmanians do than people in other states, where there isn't a college, remember, there are only colleges in Burnie, Devonport, Launceston and Hobart. There isn't one in St Helens, there isn't one in Smithton, where I went to primary school, there isn't one in Queenstown, there isn't one in New Norfolk, there isn't one in Huonville. Until very recently, you've had to drive or have someone drive you an hour or 2 to get to college. You've had to go away and board. Not every 15 or 16-year-old wants to do that. Not every 15 or 16-year-old's parents want them to do that, especially if they didn't go to year 12 themselves, which most of them didn't. Anywhere else in the country, kids doing years 7, 8, 9 and 10 see every day as the role models that they look up to You know, kids doing year 11 and 12. They don't get their pictures in the papers by dropping out at year 10 and being photographed in a nice suit or dress attending what they call a leavers dinner, as we used to do in Tasmania. And I think that needs to change, that every Tasmanian kid should have the same right that every kid in every other state and territory of the Commonwealth does, which is to complete year 12 where they start year 7. And you know, we ought to be asking ourselves, if our system of separate colleges is so good, how come no other state or territory has copied it? You know, how come our education bureaucrats' diaries aren't filled up with meetings of their counterparts from other states saying, we want to learn about your fabulous college system because it produces such good results that we want to understand it and reproduce it in our own states and territories, which of course none of them do. Now, let me say in passing, I'm not saying the colleges do a bad job of educating the kids who go to them. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that the system acts as a barrier to more kids going to them and benefiting from the education that's there. And in my view, it's time we changed that, but no side of politics is willing to acknowledge that. Second, as I've said, I think we need to reduce our dependence on tourism. Now, you know, if this is being reported, I'm going to get a ton of bricks thrown at me by Luke Martin and others. And I'm not saying that tourism is a bad thing, but you can have too much of a good thing. And I think that's potentially where we put ourselves here in Tasmania. Third, one of the advantages that we do have in Tasmania is our renewable energy resources. You know, we can lead the world in responding to climate change in that way. And if the federal and state governments get behind the idea of putting 2 more cables across Bass Strait and making sure that, unlike the one we've got, it actually works all of the time, then you know, we can make quite a lot of money by exporting renewable power to the mainland, or allowing wind and solar generators on the mainland to do more there by using our resources to firm their commitments to supply electricity. Or without going back to the sort of economy we built in the 50s and 60s, we might be able to develop new energy intensive industries like data processing or hydrogen activities. Fifth, we need to reform our state tax system so that we're not as dependent on handouts from Canberra as we've become. You know, without going into the detail, because Yulia's reminding me that I've just about run out of time, Tasmania collects a higher share of the state taxes we do from bad taxes. You know, that is stamp duty on land transfers and insurance taxes. We collect a higher proportion of our state tax revenue from bad taxes than any state except Victoria. And we collect a lower share of our tax revenue from good taxes, if any tax is good, that is payroll tax and land tax, than any state except Queensland. And we ought to change that. And one of the ways in which we ought to change it is to stop giving preferential tax treatment to small businesses just because they're small. You know, one of the things that economists know but almost no one else does is that it's nonsense that small business is the engine room of our economy, or indeed of anybody else's. You know, people think payroll tax is a bad tax because it taxes employment, and therefore it should be abolished, for example, by raising the GST, even though that's effectively a tax on wages as well, if you think about actually how it works from a business perspective. The reality is that since 2007, employment at small businesses in Tasmania has dropped by 12%, even though they don't pay payroll tax, whereas employment at big businesses has risen by 7.2%, and employment at medium-sized businesses has risen by 16%, even though they have to pay payroll tax. Even in the last 5 years, which has been pretty good for Tasmania, small businesses only accounted for 13% of the increase in private sector employment, whereas the employers who actually have to pay payroll tax have accounted for 87% of the increase in employment. You know, most small businesses actually don't want to create more jobs precisely because if they do, they'll have to start paying payroll tax. Despite what people say about big businesses being the one who don't pay their fair share of tax, research by the Tax Office shows that small business accounts for 49% of the tax that the Tax Office doesn't collect.
Whereas big business only accounts for about 9% of the tax that should be paid but isn't. And high net worth individuals account for 4% of the tax that should be paid but isn't. And the difference
is you and me, you know, who claim for work-related expenses that aren't really work-related, or don't declare that extra bit of interest or dividends that we might have on the side. But small business is the champion tax evader in this country, and their penalty for that is to get to pay 5% less by way of company tax than bigger companies do, or not to pay payroll tax. In my view, what we should be doing is giving tax breaks, which in Tasmania would mean payroll tax breaks, to new businesses, not small ones. Now, most new businesses, of course, will be small, although a new business from a Tasmanian perspective could be a medium-sized Victorian or Queensland business that we manage to lure here, in which case, as far as we're concerned, it's a new business. But there are four reasons why preferentially treating new businesses is better than preferentially taxing small ones. One is that new businesses are more likely to start in areas that have a long-run future, whereas most small businesses are in industries that great-grandfather started in a different economic era, and where the current proprietor doesn't want to do anything other than hand the same business on to his great-grandchildren. Second reason is that new businesses are actually more likely to create jobs than small ones. Third reason is new businesses are more likely to be innovative than small ones. Indeed, the main reason why new businesses are established is so that the person who's starting it can bring a new product to market, or can produce something that's already being produced in a new and different way. And the fourth reason is that there aren't as many new businesses as there are small ones, so the cost of not collecting tax from them is a lot less. And one final reason, of course, is that there's nothing a new business can do to stop becoming an old one, except by going out of business, in which case it doesn't cost anything to give them a tax concession. Whereas we know that small businesses deliberately stop short of whatever threshold it is that defines them as a small business, which is one of the reasons why small business actually doesn't create employment, because they don't want it, because otherwise they lose their tax concessions. Whereas if we preferentially tax new businesses, we might actually achieve the objectives that we say we want of creating employment, of getting into new industries with better long-term prospects, of encouraging innovation and economic growth. But in order to do that, we have to stop believing politicians and others when they say small business is the engine room of the economy. We have to stop believing, as politicians have encouraged us to do, that there is something inherently more noble about running a small business than there is about working for a big one, or for a government, or for a not-for-profit or a charity. It's not true. You know, I've got nothing against small business people. I run a small business myself. But that doesn't mean I believe that I'm better than anyone else, or that I should pay less tax than other people who, for example, might be earning a wage and salary. Now, as I say, they're not all of the answers, but I think, and what I hope is, that I've sort of given you some things to think about how Tasmania could and should be different. And for all of that, yeah, let me say, share. Arigato, spasiba, merci beaucoup, and thank you.
I'm going to stand here for a bit. Thank you very much, Saul. Very insightful. I've got one question I'd like to sort of pose to you. What I'd like to do is just briefly open it up to the floor and see whether there might be some questions from the floor in relation to any of the aspects that Saul's touched on this morning, which has been really insightful. One of the things, Saul, that I do appreciate whenever I hear you speak is you do challenge the norm, you challenge the convention. And
it irritates a lot of people.
But I think we have to, because, I mean, we're a very small population. We need to be ready to open our mind to new possibilities and new ideas. And so, firstly, is there any questions from the floor that you might like to ask Saul this morning as a result? Please.
Oh, hello, Saul. Hello, everyone. And my name is Emily. So I'm really impressed by your speech as usual, because I saw you speaking at the news all the time. So the question I would like to ask you is that since that the majority of the audience here are migrants, come from migrant background, from your experience, and would you please give us advice on what kind of opportunities or contributions you think migrants in Tasmania should contribute to the society, and maybe more specifically on economics?
Yeah. All right, Emmeline.
Sure.
Oh, well, no, I'll do that. That's fine. Emmeline is asking what sort of contribution should or could people from migrant backgrounds be making. That's a fair summary, Emmeline? Yeah. So I'm not sure that there's anything special I would say that migrants should be doing that other Australian citizens, who've been, and after all, unless you're of Aboriginal heritage, well, we're all migrants in some way. But if you mean specifically people who don't come from English-speaking backgrounds, what should they be doing? Well, my first answer is everything that people who do come from English-speaking backgrounds should be doing. So, voting, working if you can, paying taxes rather than avoiding them, making sure your kids get a good education, at least a year 12, and beyond that's not for everyone. There's nothing wrong with a trade qualification. It's as good as a university qualification. You've got the right aptitude. But I think whatever kids do, they should get a year 12 education. So make sure they go to year 12 and then do whatever it is that they want to do. So everyone, wherever they come from, should be doing those sorts of things. Volunteering if you can, being nice to your neighbours, obeying the law, all of those sorts of things that we tell our kids from that high that they should be doing. We don't always do them ourselves, but that's part of it. In addition, people who come from non-English speaking backgrounds, kind of bring what you know and share it with the rest of us who don't know that stuff. Now that might be aspects of your culture that enrich us. It might be connections, guanxi, as you say in Chinese, connections with, probably bad pronunciation, but connections with other markets that you can open doors either to your own business or to a business that you work in because you speak the language, because you understand the culture, because you know where people are, that someone who's lived here all their life can never possibly know. That's sort of one thing. Well, that's the second thing. Potentially, at some point, go back to that other country and see if you can yourself open up export markets for your own business or for someone else's. Tell other people in your country about what life in Tasmania is like and encourage them to migrate here if they're thinking of doing it. Because how else are we going to make Tasmania a more multicultural place like other states are if more people from other countries don't come here? And one of the ways in which it happens is because people, one pioneer of a family might be the first person to come here, and then they tell other people in their family, or they sponsor them out, and that's how communities from particular countries tend to grow. Especially nowadays when most people aren't fleeing wars, as the Europeans who came here after the Second World War typically were fleeing wartime destruction. They had nowhere else to go. So they kind of thought, well, what's as far away in the world as where our lives have been destroyed in? And kind of Australia and New Zealand are that. Well, that's not where migration comes from these days. It's much more from family connection. So there are other things as well, but there's some of those things.
Thanks, Saul. Sorry, Jade.
From my interaction with the multicultural communities, when I was preparing for this talk, I noticed many people are wondering how they can apply their expertise to the Tasmanian human and then physical geography, because so many IT experts, for example, and in finance, accounting, for example, they came here because of government guidance. So what does that mean for Tasmania? Does it mean in some way? Then how come we become involved or practice in those areas?
Yeah. Do I need to repeat that question, or you said it loudly enough that Zoom will pick it up? Yeah, okay, that's fine, Jade, thank you. So one of the reasons why we've attracted people to study in some of those things, and I dare say if I look around, some of you people are studying IT or accountancy and things like that, is because from a university's perspective, you know, they're not expensive courses to teach, unlike say medicine, for example, or maybe engineering. They're not all that expensive to teach. And it's a good way of generating revenue. Our universities have become very dependent on fees paid by international students, partly because the federal government has cut their funding to universities. And so universities have looked for, well, how else can we generate revenue in order to support our research, which is very important for universities. And foreign students is one of those things. And I suppose the universities think it's not our job to create jobs for those people in Tasmania. It's our job to educate them. That's all. That's our job to do. And so there's a sort of disconnect between what universities are doing in terms of teaching people skills, and then whether or not people can actually use those skills in Tasmania or have to go to the mainland or to some other country, whether it's the country they originally came from, or they go to America or Canada or Britain or something like that, in order to apply those skills because they can't do them here. Now, part of the answer might be for the government to think about, you know, well, can we? I'm not, some people are, I'm not a fan of governments deciding what industries are going to work here and then saying we're only going to give grants to those industries, because governments usually don't have any better idea than anybody else. You know, this state is, most countries are littered with failed examples of governments having tried to pick winners. They don't know, bureaucrats wouldn't have a clue. If they really had a clue, they'd get out and do it themselves and keep the profits for themselves rather than telling government that they should do it. They don't know. What I think government should do is create an environment where people who either do know or are prepared to take the risks involved, including losing some money, of trying to figure out what's sustainable, where they can do it. And that's an economist's view, and there are lots of other people who think, well, you know, it's kind of Korea or Singapore or Japan or China, kind of, you know, they had some bureaucrats sit down in the government office and work out which industries they needed to be good at, and then they just did. That's not really true either, because what those countries did was that they looked at other countries that were rich, saw what industries they had, and so Japan copied a lot of stuff from Germany, for example, and then Korea and other Asian countries copied a lot from Japan. You say, look at what they've got, we want what they've got, let's go out and get it. And of course, if you know what they're doing, you don't have to invent it yourself, you just, you know, have to acquire the know-how somehow, which might be sending your bright kids to universities in their countries and getting them to learn. There are sometimes other more nefarious ways of acquiring knowledge and technology, but that's probably the best way. It's once you've actually got to being a rich country like Japan has or Singapore does, you can't copy anyone else anymore. You've got to come up with the ideas yourself, and that's sort of why Japan has, for the last 30 years, I think, stagnated, because they haven't moved past a model where MITI, the Ministry of Economic Industry, International Trade and Industry, would kind of look at what other countries are doing, say, let's copy that, let's do it better than they do, which they did. You know, they've got to come up with ideas of their own. My view is that bureaucrats can't really do that. They can help create an environment where other people can come up with the ideas, but they can't come up with the ideas themselves. But I mean, what I'm saying, I suppose, is that, you know, governments actually here have been saying, let's grow tourism. You know, the government here is kind of desperate to say, let's reinvent the forestry industry, not necessarily because they think, you know, we're going to do well at forestry, but because they can then have a fight with their political opponents over it and maybe win another election. You know, politicians do that sort of thing sometimes. So, you know, maybe we see if we had a bit less focus on tourism and a bit more, let's kind of create an environment where people can figure out things for themselves, take some risks, be rewarded, you know, new businesses, so we'll give them a grant rather than just some small business that's been small for the last 200 years. You know, that's the sort of environment that personally, you know, I think is hard to say this is the answer, but you're more likely to look back after 10 years and say, gee, we helped a whole lot of other people find the answers.
Oh, sorry, Jay.
Sounds like to follow the policies, help ourselves, we need to make our voice.
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Jade, and thanks, Saul, gentlemen.
Thank you.
just wanted to know, like I've talked to a lot of people who come from the mainland to Tasmania, and they say like everything they buy and they consume in Tasmania is much, much more expensive than what they had in the mainland. So why don't we create an atmosphere of manufacturing in Tasmania which would actually create more jobs?
Fair question, Neil. And you're right about almost everything except housing. Although that's not as cheap as it used to be, and for renting in particular, it's not as cheap as it used to be. But with the exception of housing, private schools, if you send your kids to private schools, that's certainly a lot cheaper than it is on the mainland. Almost everything else is more expensive. Part of the reason for that's often transport costs. Now, for example, it's inevitable that petrol will be more expensive here than it is on the mainland, although there's no reason why it should be 20 cents a litre more expensive. You know, but the petrol companies are ripping us off. And there are some other things where that's true, but basically it's either transport costs or it's scale. Now, what you say about manufacturing in Tasmania versus the mainland is exactly true about manufacturing in Australia versus the rest of the world. Okay? We have a small manufacturing sector in Australia. You know, it's about 8% of our national economy. In Germany and Japan, it's sort of 15–20%. In most others, it's around 12%. However, let me say something that sounds really simple, but it's an important part of understanding. The sum of different sectors' shares of GDP cannot be more than 100%. Right? Now, that sounds really basic, but you'd be staggered at how many politicians can't understand that, or bureaucrats. And the reason it's important is that we have a big mining sector. Now, mining is 10% of Australia's GDP. The only other Western country that has a bigger share of mining is Norway, and mining there is oil and gas. Oil and gas is some of ours too. That's 15% of GDP. Canada is close to us, it's about 8%. Most other Western countries, it's 2 or less. Okay, why do we have a big mining sector? Because we've got lots of minerals under our ground. You know, different people have different beliefs as to why they're there, but they're there. So, and the rest of the world's prepared to pay a lot of money for those products. So we have a big mining sector. Like almost every other Western country, between 2/3 and 3/4 of our economy is in services. When I say Western, I should say advanced rather than Western, but advanced. So I'm also talking about Singapore and Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan, not just Europe and North America. And the reason for that is that everywhere, in any culture, the richer people are, the more of their income they want to spend on healthcare, education, travel, entertainment, financial services, what have you, having met their basic material goods like food and clothing. Right? You know, there's only so many refrigerators and TV sets you need in your house, whereas you can always have more, you know, visits to the doctor, more education, more overseas holidays. And most services aren't tradable. You know, at the margin, you know, education, I suppose, is tradable too, but you can't import haircuts. It's pretty difficult to import, you know, hospital treatment. So if you want an economy where what's produced is what people want to spend their money on, then any rich country is bound to have 3/4 to 2/3 of its economy in services, unless you want to be like Stalin and, you know, the economy produces tractors at the #1 tractor factory because the 5-year plan says we've got to produce 500 tractors whether anyone wants to buy them. So if you say 3/4 is going to be services and 10% of Australia's mining, what's left to be smaller so that the sum can't add it to 100%? Well, construction's one, but we in Australia like to live in big houses and we spread ourselves around a big continent, so we have to spend more building roads and airports, so it's hard to be constructed. That really only leaves manufacturing. So if we wanted a bigger manufacturing sector, we'd sort of have to say, even though the rest of the world is prepared to pay $130 a tonne for iron ore, we're going to leave it in the ground so that we can have more people screwing nuts on the wheels of Holdens or sewing buttons on t-shirts as we used to do in the 70s and 80s. And we would be poorer as a result. And so, you know, we have a small manufacturing sector because we have a big mining sector and a slightly bigger agricultural sector, and we have that because we're good at it. You know, it's the same thing as Tasmania has a bigger agricultural sector than other states because we're good at it. The other point about it is if you look around the world at countries which are good at manufacturing, it isn't only because they might have good engineers or scientists, or like Germany, they might spend a lot of money on technical education and have a good technical education, good apprenticeship system. It's also because they've got scale. So remember, there's a lot of fixed costs in manufacturing. You have to have a big factory on land. You probably have to commit to buying a lot of electricity, whether you use it or not. You have contracts to use materials. All that. So there's a lot of fixed costs. And in order to get them down, you need scale. You need to sell a lot of widgets in order to cover your fixed costs. How do you get scale? Two ways. One, you have a big market of your own. America, Japan, China now, India, if it ever gets there, you got a big market of your own. Or if you don't have a big market of your own, you export. So who are good at exporters? Well, Japan is good at that too. Korea, Taiwan, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden. Why are they good at exports? Because they happen to have, apart from having good engineers and stuff, they happen to be next door to big countries. They're all quite close. Everywhere in Europe is pretty close. Korea's next to Japan, Taiwan is there, they're all next to China. So big markets next door. And that matters because manufactured goods tend to be bulky, except for watches and things like that. The only way to send manufactured goods to another country is by ship or road or rail, okay? And despite the fact that we in Australia like to say the rise of Asia means we've solved the tyranny of distance, if you get out an atlas or a globe, Berlin is closer to Beijing than Brisbane is. Melbourne is Melbourne is further away from Mumbai than Manchester is. Or Sydney is further away from Shanghai than Stockholm is. We're still a long way away. And unlike European countries, we can't send stuff to China or India by rail or road, whereas you can now. You can rail stuff from anywhere in France or Germany to the heart of China. We can't do that. We won't ever be able to do it. We're not on Belt and Road. So we can't get scale. The only time we've ever had a big manufacturing sector, which we did from about 1920 until 1990, the way we did it was by erecting tariff walls, by protecting Australian industry. Now, protection sounds something nice and cuddly. How could you be against protection? I sometimes say, I'm not sure whether this will resonate with everyone, but when people talk about protection in the context of trade, they mean it in the same way that the mafia means it when they talk about protection. It's what we did was force Australians to pay higher than necessary prices for what often badly made goods, simply to create jobs for people screwing nuts on the wheels of Holdens or sewing buttons on t-shirts. And the interesting thing is that as soon as Australians were given any choice in the matter, for example, to buy foreign cars, that's what they did. Even though we imposed big taxes on them, and we still have a luxury car tax, they still prefer to buy foreign cars because they're better made, they use less fuel, they're safer. Most of them are now 4 cylinders, which is, the Australian car industry couldn't be bothered making 4-cylinder cars in any sort of, they continue to think all we want is V8 Holdens and Falcons. Industries like that don't deserve to survive, in my view. And just as I said, there is nothing inherently noble about running a small, just because you run a small business doesn't mean you're a better person than someone who works for a big business. In my view, there's nothing more noble about manufacturing than any other type of economic activity. If it works in your country, because you've got the skills, because you've got the big domestic market, or you're close to some other bigger export, fine, go for it. But that's not us. And just as it's not us for Australia as a whole, even more so is it not us for Tasmania relative to the rest of the country, because unless it's something special that you can make people pay a high price for, because it's got some unique attribute, and we do that with wine. We don't sell wine made in Tasmania for $10 a bottle. We sell it for $35 a bottle to people who recognise that it's really good. You know, or we don't sell beef to McDonald's. You know, the kind of beef we sell, and I think about those people who do grow Wagyu on Robbins Island, which is near where I lived as a kid. You know, we produce beef that sells in restaurants in Tokyo for, you know, the equivalent of $150, because we need to be able to sell it at that price in order to overcome the cost of small scale and then having to ship it to Melbourne and then ship it from Melbourne to Japan. And so the only state, if you can find manufacturing that we can do, and some of it we can do. I mean, Incat can do it in ships. You know, we can do that. There's probably some defence manufacturing that we can do here. You find the bits that we can do, and if we can command a high price for them that covers the extra costs of being small and having to transport twice, fine. But just to say, you know, look at some other country and say, well, they've got a big manufacturing sector, why can't we have one? Without understanding what the differences between us and them are, you're just going to waste money.
Thank you, Saul. You pinched my question, by the way. It was a very good question. I was actually going to ask Saul about the manufacturing sector, given some of the commentary you provided this morning around our reliance on some of the service economies, such as tourism. So thanks for asking that question, and a really, really well-rounded and insightful response, Saul, because I think there's some opportunities for some manufacturing, but we need to be looking at where our, I guess, our capability and our strength lies, so that we can achieve some of the things that Saul put on the close of his particular point there, which was, you know, we've got to be able to produce something that people value, that we can actually get the return, so that we don't find ourselves like mice on the wheel, so to speak. So, yeah, it was really, really insightful. So thank you for that question, and thank you for your response. Now, I'm conscious, Jade, we might need to take a break, but just before we do that, is there any last questions that we might put to the floor? Yes.
Hello. I got one question. You have mentioned the renewable energy will export to the mainland in a good way. So what kind of renewable energy is the focus on, like the wind all the time? Or do we have like the biomass renewable energy in Tasmania?
Yeah.
This is the first question. And the second one is you have mentioned that the new company and the difference between new company and small company. Can you be more detailed about what kind of new company is that in, or is that new areas to become a new company, or?
Fair enough. So it was May, you said that I should, May. Yeah, okay, thanks for the questions, May. There's two of them. So one was about what kind of renewable energy could Tasmania do, and the other one was about what area might new businesses start working. Okay, if I forget the second one, remind me of it. The first one I'll answer in part, and I should disclose to you I was on the board of Hydro Tasmania for 10 years. I haven't been since September 2018, but what I know about that sort of comes from that experience. So the answer, I think, is probably not tidal, because we don't have places. What do I know? Okay. Okay, well, you might know more about this than I do, so if I'm wrong, tell me. But we don't have places like they do in Canada, in the Bay of Fundy, where the tides are massive, or, you know, like they do at the top of the Kimberleys in Western Australia, where you can, you know, stick a turbine in a tide and I don't think we have sites like that, so that's probably not it. We can certainly do wind. You know, this is one of the windiest places in the world. My parents lived for 20 years at a place called Marrawar. I don't know whether any of you have been there, but if you drive from Launceston to Devonport and Burnie and keep going until the road stops, that's Marrawar. And you could look out my parents' window, and my dad used to say if the world was flat, you could wave to Argentina, because that's the next piece of land in that direction. And so it's really windy. And of course, there are wind farms there. You know, you could see the one on Cape Grim out my parents' window. I'm not sure, I read someone said you would be able to see the one at Jim's Plains near Montague from Marrawar as well. That's not true. I know that area. But yeah, we're going to put one there. We're going to put some on Robbins Island, supposedly. We've got some at Muscle Row in the northeast. We've got a new one being built at Granville Harbour that's on the west coast, northwest of Zingan. Yeah. And we've got the Cattle Hill one that's behind, just inside from Lake Echo, and there'll probably be more. So we can do wind. Solar, I don't know as much about. Clearly, we're not hot like the South Australian desert, but on the other hand, in summer in particular, we have more hours of sunshine than anywhere in the southern hemisphere except for Chile and Argentina and the bottom end of New Zealand, because there's no other land down here, right? So in summer, remember that now the peak in electricity demand on the mainland, not here, the peak in electricity demand here is still in winter, but in Victoria and in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide, it's in summer because everyone's got air conditioning. So even though we don't think of Tasmania as a hot place, Hobart has more hours of sunshine than any other capital except Adelaide. That's partly cloud cover, or lack of it. So we probably could do solar, but the cost, we might have to wait for the cost to come down a bit more than it does. And the other thing, of course, we have is hydropower. Right? Now, I'm going to sound a bit biased here, but the mantra is that anything snowy can do, hydro can do cheaper. Hydro can do anything cheaper than you. If you reckon, there was a song from a 1950s musical that went along those lines. And the reason is that even though Snowy looks bigger, this is the one that's on the border between Victoria and New South Wales, and the Snowy Mountains was a great post-war nation building project. The Snowy system has more multiple uses, so they have to use a lot of their water for irrigation. And they also have to use a lot of water to keep the Snowy River flowing into Victoria. All right? And generally speaking, there's only one power station on each river, below each dam. Whereas in Tasmania, although a bit of water is used out of hydro schemes for irrigation, most of it just goes back into rivers. And with a couple of exceptions, the Franklin, the Gordon Dam being one, but most of the others there are, you use the same water multiple times. There's 7 power stations on the Derwent, there's 5 or 6 on the Mersey Forth, there's 3 on the King, and here there's 3 on the Pyman River and its tributaries. You can use the water multiple times, and you don't have to build as many tunnels. So in order for what Hydro's proposing by way of pumping water back uphill when the cost of power is low and then running it downhill, it sounds silly, but if you think there's different prices, right? So if you pump water uphill at night when no one's using electricity and the price is low, and then you run it downhill when everyone's got their aircon running, you actually make money that way. Right? So in order to do that, you have to build tunnels. And the tunnels that would be required to build the 3 options that Hydro's looking at, 2 of them, the tunnels are about 7 kilometres long, the other one's about 12. And tunnelling is the most expensive thing. You think about what's actually entailed. It's not stringing up wires, it's digging through mountains of rock. None of the schemes being considered in Snowy have tunnels of less than 50 kilometres. One of our challenges, however, is that the federal government now owns all of Snowy. They owned a bit to begin with, but they bought out New South Wales and Victoria's shares, and they've already put something like $2 billion into it by way of equity, so they're biased. Right? Whereas Hydro Tasmania is owned by the Tasmanian government. But Hydro's pumped hydro schemes are actually cheaper than Snowy's. And even though you might think, well, don't we have to build cables across Bass Strait, which is true, you have to build cables to take the extra power from the Snowy Mountains to Sydney or Melbourne, and that's actually further. That's actually further. And while, yes, it costs money to lay cable under Bass Strait, you don't have to buy anyone's land. You don't have to march telegraph poles, big transmission poles through anyone else's land, whereas you do have to do that to get from Snowy to Melbourne or Sydney. So we can do it cheaper, but we have to overcome what is a bias on the part of the federal government towards their own scheme. Now, you will understand this because you're an engineer. I'm not sure everyone else will. But for the technical problem with renewables, I mean, it's not expensive to do it anymore because the cost of the turbines and the plates has come down. The technical problem is still that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, especially when people want to use electricity. So in order to sell that electricity into the market, what the people who produce it have to do is what's called firm the contract. In a sense, they almost have to provide a guarantee that they will be able to deliver the power that they have said that they would deliver, irrespective of whether the wind is blowing or the sun isn't shining. Okay? So in other words, they have to enter into a contract with someone else. It's sort of like an option for those of you who do finance. You have to enter into a contract with some other power generator in order to be able to guarantee that you can sell the renewable energy, right? Now, the best way of doing that is hydro, because hydro is easy to switch on and off. Okay? And the water is there, provided you don't have a long drought. The difference between hydro and other renewables is it doesn't matter whether the wind's blowing or the sun's shining, as long as you've got some water in a dam, usually do, then you can deliver it in electricity, right? So, whereas with a coal-fired power station, or even a gas one, is actually quite a lot of work involved in ramping it up or down. You will know more about that than I do. My guess, I'm not sure whether you can do it out of kelp, which we've got a lot of. You might be able to. Whether you can do it out of trees, I don't know. But my point is that Tasmania, Hydro Tasmania, can supply the firming, that is, the guarantee that renewable energy, wind and solar generators can honour their contracts. And it doesn't have to be Tasmanian wind generators either. I mean, a Victorian wind energy or a solar factory can contract with Hydro Tasmania to deliver electricity on the off chance that the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. And our system is, so hydro can make money, and of course if hydro makes money, they pay most of it to the state government, and then the state government can either spend it or lower everyone else's taxes. Another possibility could be, of course the Tasmanian government said we want to have it, most countries want to have 100% renewables by some date. We said we're going to be 200% renewable. In other words, we're going to produce twice as much energy from renewable sources as we need. Now, some people think, oh, that's goody, that means we can have another zinc works. Some people might say that's a way of getting manufacturing. Of course, what that also means is you fill the river up with, there are some Australian words that you can say that our rivers have been full up with that we mightn't necessarily want to do. And they don't necessarily, they create some jobs, but not necessarily a lot. They do make you depend on volatile commodity prices, among other things, but that's one possibility. Another possibility might be we can run data centers because they're very electricity intensive, and they also don't like being in hot places. So if climate change is making places where data centers currently are hotter, then Tasmania might be on, I mean, we're going to get warmer as well, but not by as much as places that are closer to the equator. So that's a possibility that, we could set ourselves up as a place for data centers. I don't know enough about the science behind this, but some people also say we could do hydrogen industry. Now, I have no idea what that actually entails, except I'm told it uses a lot of electricity. So, there are options like that we could do. But as a minimum, you've got exporting to the mainland as a fallback. If nothing else, you can export it to the mainland. If we can do things with it ourselves that create jobs as well, so much the better. Right? To go to your second question about new versus small business, the whole point, I suppose, of what I'm trying to say, I don't know what those industries are. But what I'm saying is let's create an environment where either people who do know or who think they know and are willing to take the risks associated with being wrong, that is losing their money, in the hope that if they're right, they'll make lots of money, is to create an environment where they're more likely to do that in Tasmania than somewhere else. So if we said to someone, for the first 5 years, you don't have to pay payroll tax. If you manage to go from having no employees to having 100 employees, where in Australia, in Tasmania at the moment, you would be paying payroll tax, we'll say for the first 5 years, you don't pay payroll tax. After that, no secret deals under the table, you pay. And of course, you would kind of hope if they do have 100 employees, those employees want to stay in Tasmania, they don't want to move. So the boss will take that into account and think, well, yeah, I'll lose all my good workers if I move. So even though I have to pay payroll tax, it's probably still worth paying. And as I say, the thing is, I don't know what those industries are. Yeah, I can guess, but I don't know. I can bet you no bureaucrat in state growth knows. Yeah, again, they might think they've got some ideas, and some of the ideas might be right, but there's no guarantee that they will be. And I think if people are going to make bets which effectively that's what capitalism is, people making bets, preferably with their own money rather than with taxpayers' money or someone else's money. You know, good on them, and let's create an environment where people are willing to do that.
Thanks, Saul. We've got one last question, and I apologise for running over, and then I'll pass back to Jade. Saul, this particular question comes from one of our online listeners today. A lot of migrants are very well skilled and well qualified, yet they find it very difficult sometimes to get employment within the area of their discipline or their specialisation.
Because they won't recognise, our people won't recognise the
Yeah,
qualifications.
so do you have any sort of suggestions or thoughts around what they might do to sort of, I guess, achieve a more favourable or successful outcome in a very highly competitive job market? And we know that we're going to be in that probably for a lengthier period of time.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, not something I've thought about a lot, off the top of my head, one thing would be to find some way of persuading our registration authorities, our qualification authorities, to recognise. Now that might be to send some bureaucrat over to whichever university system it is, so that we can be satisfied that someone with a degree from a country we might not know much about, you know, actually has got the same skill set as someone from one of our own universities. There's a bit of work involved in doing that, but it's probably a cheaper way of increasing the supply of skilled people than insisting that they start doing the whole course all over again, as well as not being a waste of that person's life and human capital. So that's one possibility.
What about for those that have come to Australia, studied, are on a pathway to permanent residency, or indeed have achieved their residency? They now find themselves as residents of Australia, well qualified, but finding it difficult to find employment in their chosen discipline, for example.
Yeah. Is that because the qualification's not recognised?
No, well, I'm talking about those that might have come to Australia and studied through an Australian institution.
Well, I suppose they're in the same position as someone who's you know, been here, you know, all his or her life, or for multiple generations, and then decides to do something at university and finds he or she can't get a job. You know, that's, you know, yeah, I mean, you can't, I don't think you can come to a country, or if you live in the country, do a course and expect that someone owes you a job in that specialty if there isn't a demand for it. You know, you might, if it's because you are qualified, there is demand for it, but somehow the system won't recognise your qualifications, then that's a legitimate complaint and something ought to be done about it. But if you, as I say, either choose to come to Australia with a qualification to do something for which there's no demand, or if you decide to do it yourself here, you know, you're an Anglo, you're a skip, and you've decided to do some course in basket weaving or whatever, and there's no demand for basket weavers, well, that's your fault. That's your problem.
Yeah, look, I appreciate that, Saul, because I mean, as I say, this was a question that we got through the online room, and it's always difficult to know what the specific context might be. So broadly, I hope I've represented that person, you know, truly.
I mean, what I'd say specifically is that there is no valid reason why we shouldn't recognise a qualification from, you know, a Chinese or an Indian university or something. Yeah, I mean, you can't let people be doctors, for example, unless the health authorities are satisfied here that qualification they have is as good as an Australian one. But you shouldn't start from the assumption that it isn't.
No, that's correct, and we could talk on that a lot because we used to have a process here in Tasmania through the Tasmanian Qualification Authority, which actually had an area that actually did some of that work, particularly in relation to vocational and to a lesser extent higher education. Look, Saul, thank you so much. If I could just ask you all to express your appreciation for Saul this morning, and then I'll pass over.
I'd have to go. But...
Thank you so much, Saul. Definitely give us a lot to think about.